In autumn 1885, the Scots writer Robert Louis Stevenson, best known for writing a pirate story and a series of poems for children, had a very adult nightmare.
The most racking pangs succeeded, the grinding of the bones. There was something strange in my sensations. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be tenfold more wicked. And in that moment, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde.
Man is not truly one, but two. Now, supposing we could break that chain, separate those two selves, free the good in man and let it go on to its higher destiny, and segregate the bad. Let it destroy itself in its own degradation.
In January 1886, a story was published which redrew the map of horror. Instead of devils and demons outside, it dealt with devils and demons inside, and in the process introduced a new phrase into the English language.
Did you think that Dr. Jekyll was falling in love with you? You with your cheap little dreams? Or did you think as you looked at him that perhaps in his eyes you saw a bit of me, Hyde?
The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde made the 35-year-old author Robert Louis Stevenson famous. And Stevenson always insisted that the name be pronounced Jekyll, partly because that's the way Scots people said it, and partly because it meant that Hyde and Jekyll rhymed with hide and seek. But the story is more, much more than the shilling shocker we all think we've read, for it dramatized conflicts and tensions within Stevenson himself, between public life and private life, between reality and dreams, between conformity and art, and even between the narrow, winding alleyways or closes of Edinburgh's old town and the planned, wide-open spaces of the new town. Above all, perhaps, between the adult and the child. For the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde began life in the nightmares experienced by Robert Louis Stevenson in the darkness of his childhood. At night, in the silent theatre of his mind, he would shut out the world with thoughts of romance and adventure, and nightmares of damnation, weaving dreams around the wardrobe in his room. From all this would come his famous stories, such as Treasure Island with its one-legged pirate, tales of sunny days, sometimes dark nights. It was a joyless childhood, he later recalled, full of fear, insomnia, painful days, and interminable nights. It was here in this solid and tidy terrace of houses called Heriot Row, in the heart of Edinburgh's new town, that Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson grew up. His father was from a family of engineers who'd built most of Scotland's deep-sea lighthouses around the dangerous coast, and his mother was from a family of advocates and ministers of the church. So Louis, as he was called, their only child, grew up according to the strict mid-Victorian rules of Edinburgh's professional class, where the word respectable was the highest possible praise. But he was a sickly, breathless child who always seemed undernourished, overexcitable, and the victim of every illness that was going the rounds. So he spent most of his early life in the bedroom of number 17, Heriot Row. He may also have had a thyroid condition, which would account for his distended bone structure, not shared by either of his parents. Since his mother Margaret was a permanent invalid at this time, suffering from weak lungs and stress, and his father Thomas was often away on business as a consultant to the Northern Lighthouses, Lewis's closest relationship was with his full-time nurse, a fisherman's daughter and fundamentalist Christian from Fife called Alison Cunningham, or Cummy. Cummy filled his head with stories about hellfire and damnation, and she read the Bible to him over and over again in the hope of persuading him that there are but two camps of people in the world, those mostly on their knees and singing hymns, and those on the high road to the gallows and the bottomless pit. In the daytime, he'd scarcely say anything without adding the words, "if I'm spared." And at night, when Cummy was in bed, he'd lie awake weeping for Jesus, terrified to close his eyes lest he went straight to hell. When he did close his eyes, not surprisingly, he had nightmares which stayed with him for the rest of his life. And in some of them, the really confusing ones, the idea of sin, he said, was strangely attractive. His book of poems for children, dedicated to my second mother, my first wife, that's Alison Cunningham, the nurse, give us a very good idea of what was on Lewis's mind as he lay here in this bed. All round the house is the jet-black night. It stares through the window pane. It crawls in the corners, hiding from the light, and it moves with the moving flame. Now my little heart goes a-beating like a drum, with the breath of the bogey in my hair. And all round the candle the crooked shadows come and go marching along up the stair. The shadow of the balusters, the shadow of the lamp, the shadow of the child that goes to bed. All the wicked shadows coming tramp, 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 with the black light overhead. The Edinburgh Robert Louis Stevenson grew up in was a city of stark contrasts. There was the clear and bright New Town, carefully planned and laid out on a grid system of wide streets, squares and tidy crescents. It was the first new town in Britain, and it made Edinburgh seem like a stylish European city. And on the other side, beyond the castle cliffs, there was the medieval Old Town, grim and dark and dangerous, with its narrow alleyways, or closes, and tall tenement buildings, or lands. Walking around the Old Town streets, Stevenson said, was like watching a derelict fall down and die. Lewis became increasingly fed up with the oppressive Presbyterian values of his parents and was drawn towards the Old Town and its underworld. "I love night in the city," he wrote, "the lighted streets and the swinging gait of harlots." This entire city of Edinburgh, he added, leads a double existence. Remember the wardrobe in Lewis's bedroom? Well, it was built by the legendary Deacon Brodie, respected cabinet maker by day, Old Town burglar by night. Brodie was hanged in 1788 on a wooden gallows of his own design. The idea that behind a man's eyes there was an inner darkness was beginning to take shape in RLS's mind. Documents export. Yep, thank you. As a young student at Edinburgh University, Robert Louis Stevenson drank with his friends here in the Rutherford Arms on Drummond Street. He wrote that prostitutes were a great deal more honest than most of their clients and started having serious rows with his father about religion.
Cheers, everyone. Cheers.
He was breaking away more and more from established Edinburgh society. By the time he became a university student studying engineering, he seemed to be leading his own double life.
As men of science, we should be curious. I shall not dwell today on the secrets of the human body, in sickness and in health. Today, I want to talk to you of a greater marvel, the soul of man. Man is not truly one, but truly two. These two carry on an eternal struggle in the nature of man, yet they are chained together. And that chain spells repression to the evil, remorse to the good. Now, if these two selves could be separated from each other, how much freer the good in us would be, what heights it might scale. And the so-called evil, once liberated, would fulfill itself and trouble us no more.
During his time as a student here, Robert Louis Stevenson kept having a strange dream adventure, as he called it, in which he spent his days working in a surgical theatre, his heart in his mouth, his teeth on edge, seeing the monstrous malformations all around him, and his nights climbing an endless circular staircase somewhere in the old town, and watching a parade of down-and-outs, unhealthy down-and-outs, coming down the stairs and past him. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, dawn had broken, and it was back to that surgical theatre again. He had this dream adventure so often that he went to see a doctor about it and was given a sedative. The dream seems to have been about the ambition that was expected of him, the spiral staircase, his guilt at being such a privileged young man, the down-and-outs, and the horror of those malformed bodies, which reminded him perhaps a little of his own. It was also about the strong medical atmosphere of the university, which was beginning to get to him. We know he spent time with fellow students in the medical faculty. But as he honed his craft as a writer, he was also drawn to the legends of Edinburgh, and in particular, ugly actions in ugly places which have the true romantic quality, as he put it. Legends such as the story of William Burke and William Hare. In the late 1820s, Burke and Hare had supplied corpses for payment to the anatomy classes of Dr. Robert Knox. And unlike others who preferred to rob graves for the purpose, and were thus known as the resurrection men, Burke and Hare had taken the shortcut of smothering their victims and thus supplying the freshest corpses in the business. When Burke was hanged in 1829, his own corpse was publicly dissected by the professor of anatomy at the university. His skeleton was donated to the permanent collection, as was his death mask. And here is the death mask of William Burke, showing the marks of the rope which hanged him. And next to it, the life mask of William Hare, because William Hare turned in his friend, went king's evidence, and thus got off scot-free. But the permanent collection of the university had something in it that was even stranger. A pocketbook bound in the skin of William Burke. Apparently, bits of Burke were essential fashion accessories amongst senior medics in the aftermath of the story. A truly bizarre reminder of the era of the resurrection men. Stevenson felt an affinity with the dark side of his city. When at last he became a professional writer, he adapted the legend of Burke and Hare into the short story, The Body Snatcher. But in his story, RLS made the university anatomy lecturer Dr. Knox the real body snatcher, not Burke and Hare. Robert Knox, respectable doctor by day, dealer in corpses by night. The forerunner of Jekyll and Hyde.
It was the policy of Dr. K to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. They bring the body and we pay the price, he used to say. To bodies that had been laid in earth in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamp-lit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities. before a class of gaping medical boys.
Now you must watch closely, gentlemen, closely. It's the very heart of the matter.
In 1873, Robert Louis Stevenson left what he called the inclement city of Edinburgh, with its obsessive concern for respectability, forever. The city burgesses were to become seriously upset by some of the things he then wrote about the place. For the next 10 years, he travelled and wrote roughish guides to his journeys in France, England and America. The Victorian equivalent of backpacking was, it seems, good for his health. Eventually, in 1884, he was advised by his doctors to move to the seaside town of Bournemouth, the unlikeliest of places, where he would write Jekyll and Hyde. Bournemouth had more hotels than any other town in the land after London. The building of a mainline railway link had recently boosted its population tenfold to 17,000 people, and its pier had just opened. The great attractions were the sea air, the promenade, the beach, the park, and the scent of gorse and heather. A critic wrote of Bournemouth at this time, "It has become a colony of health hunters, the home of British invalidism and British philistinism." It was about as far away from Edinburgh as you could get while staying on the mainland. By the time Robert Louis Stevenson moved here, he'd married a divorcee from Indianapolis who was 11 years his senior, Fanny Vandergrift Osborne. She was tough, had strong Middle Western ideas about morality, and he was known to call her Mother. His parents and family were thrilled. So much so that as a belated wedding present, Louis's father Thomas bought them a house along this road and gave Fanny £500 to furnish it. The house was a modern two-storey villa in yellow brick, which they called Skerryvore, after the most famous lighthouse built by Uncle Alan Stevenson. Today, only the layout of the foundations remain, because the house was flattened by a bomb during an air raid in the Second World War, November 1940. Louis and Fanny settled down into their new suburban existence at Easter 1885. But Louis's period of convalescence was short-lived. Bournemouth was not good for his lungs. Sometimes they were so congested that he could hardly speak, and the nightmares from his heart of darkness began again in earnest. Robert Louis Stevenson was far from being your typical suburban householder, or indeed your typical Bournemouth convalescent, and he felt rather uncomfortable throughout the 2.5 years he spent here. He said, "I do not like this health-tending, housekeeping life of mine," and compared his time in comfortable, respectable Skerryvore with living like a weevil in a biscuit. He was more seriously ill in this house than he'd ever been before, with hemorrhages and congestion of the lungs and backache and flu and fever. A neighbour called Clive Holland dropped in on him when he was at his most poorly and later recorded his reminiscences for the BBC.
I went one afternoon and was shown into a little room. I was sitting quietly there and thinking when I heard a rustling, and I looked through the door to the staircase and saw Mrs. Stevenson descending with Robert Louis in her arms, carried just as she would of a baby, with his dark hair falling over her arm. She brought him into the little room and put him down on the sofa, and I noticed what I thought a rather rebellious cast in his smile. And then she said, "You must not talk very long," and went away.
RLS was by now so ill that Fanny became his full-time nurse and protector from visitors, celebrities and autograph hunters, including some of the most celebrated artists of the day, who came to see the author of the best-selling Treasure Island, showering him with gifts which turned his provincial villa on the outside into a cluttered art gallery on the inside. The visitor to Skerryvore, such as Clive Holland or a fan or critic from London, a new feature of the Stevenson landscape, the visitor would move into the wood-panelled hall with some of the panels painted by artist friends, and this hall would take them into the dining room. Now, the dining room had William Morris wallpaper and Sheraton 18th century chairs, and over the fireplace here, an engraving of J.M.W. Turner's Bell Rock Lighthouse, a lighthouse designed by Stevenson's grandfather, and on this wall, an ornate mirror donated by the novelist Henry James. Over here, on these walls, an assortment of buccaneer weapons were nailed to the wall, gifts from fans of Treasure Island. And a portrait by the American artist John Singer Sargent, showing on one side of the picture Lewis pacing up and down, tugging at his moustache in a velvet jacket, and on the other side, very much in the background, Fanny, dressed rather bizarrely in an Indian sari, with bare feet and sitting in a large armchair. Between the two figures in the painting, as Lewis wrote, was an open door showing my palatial entrance and my respected staircase. At the top of the respected staircase, just above my head, was a library lined with books. And over here, on the second story, was Lewis's bedroom, where he spent most of his time, with its sea view, well, the trees were a little shorter in those days, and where he was surrounded by medicine bottles purchased from the local Westbourne chemist. It was in this bedroom that Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, following a nightmare after a particularly unpleasant 3-day attack of hemorrhaging and fever.
The mixture began suddenly to effervesce audibly, and the compound changed to a dark purple. He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, staring with infected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black. The features seemed to melt and alter.
Positively indecent.
Look where he did.
Your conduct was disgusting. It isn't done. It isn't done.
Stevenson had been racking his brains for a story about hypocrisy and man's double being, and he was also seriously ill.
Come back soon, won't you?
The resulting nightmare was about Dr. Jekyll taking the powder and transforming himself into Mr. Hyde, and about how the transformation then became involuntary and uncontrolled.
Free! Free at last! Ah!
The legend goes that when Stevenson woke up, he started writing feverishly. But Fanny didn't like what he'd written. It was too dark and too much of a nasty story. And that in a fit of pique, he threw the manuscript onto the fire. The story of the writing of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is almost as famous as the story itself. It goes something like this. Lewis has his nightmare, and this is followed by a feverish period of writing activity, 30,000 words in 3 days, and then Fanny Stevenson criticizing the first draft, and Lewis impetuously chucking it onto the fire to destroy it. This is followed in turn by another feverish period of activity, 6 days to write the entire story as we know it today. An incredible achievement for anyone, but for someone suffering from hemorrhaging of the lungs at the time, superhuman. Anyway, that's the authorized version of the story. In fact, unfortunately, as these unpublished and up to now unknown documents in the collection of the National Library of Scotland prove, the story didn't really happen like that at all. The nightmare did happen. Lewis wrote about it in the year after Dr. Jekyll, and there are a couple of letters dating from exactly that moment where the story is confirmed. First of all, there's Fanny Stevenson, writing to a friend in which she expresses the usual worries about Lewis's health and says he's hard at work, but she fears it will be energy wasted, as all his late work has been. And she adds, he's been suffering from dreadful nightmares and headaches at night, the association between the nightmare and the hard work. And there's another letter written by her son, Lewis's stepson, Lloyd Osborne, to Maggie Stevenson up at Heriot Row in Edinburgh, where he says, Lewis is doing very well, though still very weak. He's been writing a most terrible story, which he said occurred to him in the night. It's certainly one of the most ghostly and unpleasant stories I have ever known. But the feverish first draft and Fanny's criticism of it and the burning of the manuscript in the fire aren't mentioned in any documents of the time at all. For those, we have to wait for the authorized biography written under Fanny's supervision, and I mean close supervision, by Lewis's cousin, Graham Balfour, who was also Fanny's friend, and which is the first published version of the story of the burning of the manuscript. Now, this was published 7 years after the death of Robert Louis Stevenson. And evidently, while Balfour was researching it, he had some problems filling the story out of the Bournemouth years during the writing of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So he wrote to Fanny and Lloyd to get some extra research information. And Fanny replied, here's a bundle of the correspondence that he received while writing the book. Fanny replied with a letter that tells the story of the burning of the manuscript for the very first time. She says that she'd criticized the story and Lewis went upstairs rather dejected, and then she heard the bell ring. She adds, as I entered the door, Lewis pointed a long dramatic finger to a pile of ashes on the hearth of the fireplace, saying that I was right, and there was the tale. I nearly fainted away. And she goes on to say that Lewis took her advice with the second draft and rewrote the story as she thought it should be written, rather than he thought it should be written. Well, Balfour obviously wrote back and said, this can't be right. Robert Louis Stevenson knew what he was doing. Are you certain that he burnt a first draft, and are you certain that he didn't know what it was about? So Fanny and Lloyd write again. This is Fanny in pencil this time. She reiterates, my objection was that the story was an allegory and that he had not made it so. In other words, RLS hadn't realized that the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was allegorical, so Fanny had to tell him. Very useful lesson, I'm sure, and he burnt the first draft in a rage because she'd told him. Anyway, Balfour distilled the correspondence and the notes that he'd received into the published version of the authorized biography. And here, in print, 1901, is the classic version of the story of the burning of the manuscript.
I gave my criticism to my husband and left the room. After a while, his bell rang. On my return, I found him sitting up in bed, pointing to a pile of ashes. He had burned the entire draft. Having realized that he had taken the wrong point of view, he at once destroyed his manuscript.
That's the official account, but neither Stevenson himself nor anyone else ever mentions it at the time, and Stevenson was the sort of man who mentioned everything. So why would anyone want to make up such legends? Well, Fanny Stevenson was convinced that the paying customers for Lewis's books wanted him to be a wholesome, boyish, gallant writer of adventure stories, not the writer of nasty, sensationalist fiction. And she also knew that he had a heart of darkness within him, which could spoil everything. So she had to present herself publicly as the guardian angel who protected Lewis from himself and protected Lewis for the benefit of the public. Now, when the authorised biography by Graham Balfour came out, one of Lewis's closest friends said it made him look as though he was a seraph in chocolate or a barley sugar effigy. But it was too late. The image had stuck, and pretty soon Fanny's family started piling in, always embellishing the legend and always to Fanny's advantage. Starting off with Lloyd Osborne, her son, an intimate portrait of RLS. And then her sister, Nellie Sanchez, the life of Mrs. R.L. Stevenson. And then her daughter, Isabel Field, a memoir of Robert Louis Stevenson. And then Fanny went public herself with her introduction to the great edition of RLS's works, telling the story of the burning of the manuscript. And then the next-door neighbour from Bournemouth with a book called RLS and His Sine Qua Non, the sine qua non being Fanny, of course. And finally, I Can Remember Robert Louis Stevenson, which includes reminiscences from everyone, up to and almost including the milkman. They all seem to agree that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was an aberration, the product of a sick mind, a blot on the otherwise happy landscape of Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, the punchline of all this seems to be that maybe it would have been better if the story hadn't been published at all. But the book was published in January 1886, and after the fashionable literary critics had said it was really a morality tale rather than a horror story, so it was okay to read it, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sold 40,000 copies in the next 9 months, in Britain alone. It was a respectable book about good and evil, and it was the text for sermons all over the country. But when Richard Mansfield, an American actor-manager, brought his dramatised version to the Lyceum Theatre in autumn 1888, it was to become a little less respectable. The play doesn't seem to have survived, but it's possible to reconstruct it from the reminiscences of the actor, Richard Mansfield. In Mansfield's version, Dr. Jekyll gained a girlfriend called Agnes, and Mr. Hyde gained a motive, which was to kill her, and in fact he succeeds in killing her father. But the biggest change arose from the fact that Richard Mansfield played both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, establishing a tradition which remains to this day the way of presenting the story. Now, in the book, Mr. Hyde is smaller and younger than Jekyll. He's a different being that comes from inside the Doctor. But in the play, he was the same person, and Mansfield tried to vary his performance by making Jekyll incredibly saintly and Hyde incredibly nasty. But it was the transformation which attracted all the attention. In full view of the audience, without going behind a pillar or going off stage or bringing on a double, he simply changed from being Dr. Jekyll into being Mr. Hyde before their very eyes. How on earth did he do it? Well, first of all, he moved from his upright posture to a slight crouch, a bit like an ape. And then his sensitive fingers turned into claws, and his voice went from normal to guttural and up in volume. I have destroyed my soul. Things like that. But above all, by use of lights and makeup, he completely changed the structure of his face. The lights gradually changed and reacted with the makeup. It was as simple as that. The most difficult bit was to know whether or not the stage manager had done his job properly, because Mansfield didn't know, just as I don't know, whether the transformation had been a success. All he could do, he said, was look out into the audience. If they started fainting, he knew the transformation had been a success.
Do you want to be left as you are? Or do you want your eyes and your soul to be blasted by a sight that would stagger the devil himself?
I'm not to be persuaded by this rigmarole.
Very well, then.
So the public now had a strong visual image of the Doctor changing into a beast, and from beast to Doctor again. At precisely the same time as this transformation was happening, the young Sigmund Freud was studying hypnosis and hysteria as ways of reaching the inner person, and the new science of sexual pathology was beginning to take off. It was inevitable that people would start making connections between the two.
Edward, it's 6 o'clock. It's time you left me.
Come here! Mrs. Dobson, what is it? You constable, go get your inspector quickly! What's going on? I don't know. Hyde, come and attend to Mrs. Dobson. Go, sound the letter!
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was, according to its author, the story of a divided self, a double standard, and a heart of darkness. But in fact, whether Stevenson acknowledged the fact in public or not, there's no doubt that the story contains the most adult view of sexuality of anything he ever wrote. One reason why it's proved such a fertile ground for interpretation. In recent years, critics have written that it's really about the father-son relationship, or repressed homosexuality, or a fear, even hatred of women, or a battle between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Or it may be about Stevenson's own divided personality, between the man of action inside his head and the disabled artist he saw in the mirror, and so on. At the time, Hyde was interpreted more as an ape man or a wolf man, a kind of throwback to an animal state or an earlier stage of evolution. Charles Darwin had made it to the high street. Trouble was, although he was a wolf man, he didn't do many wolfish things, and although he represented the beast in man, he wasn't really very beastly. A series of events which occurred in the East End of London in the autumn of 1888 turned Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde into the kind of story the public wanted to read.
Try a change of luck, dearie.
Between 31st August and 9th November, a mere 10-week period, 5 unemployed women who'd turned to prostitution were murdered and savagely mutilated by an unknown killer the newspapers dubbed Jack the Ripper, in and around Whitechapel. Despite the best efforts of the Metropolitan and City police forces, he was never found. But a picture began to emerge of the sort of person this serial killer might be. The suggestion that the Ripper might be a professional man, a doctor, who had an obsession with destroying prostitutes, by far the most popular explanation in 1888, seemed to fit the case, largely because Jekyll and Hyde, book and play, had provided a ready-made model. A model to explain the inexplicable. The first of the Jack the Ripper murders happened at the end of August 1888 in the East End of London, at precisely the same time as Richard Mansfield's play was packing them in the West End, and Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was on sale in the bookshops. They also happened at a time when the medical profession, the so-called new priesthood, was getting a particularly bad press with accusations of extreme cruelty and high-handedness, and knife-happy surgeons taking advantage of vulnerable women in front of leering medical students. The result of all this was that the Whitechapel murders and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde became completely confused in the public mind. One member of the public wrote to the police suggesting that the actor Richard Mansfield had to be the prime suspect because his transformation and frenzied performance were so very convincing. Another suggested more seriously that the sensational drama might have put ideas in the Ripper's mind in the first place. Well, Richard Mansfield responded in great style by closing the play with a benefit performance for the Bishop of London's fund to to establish a laundry to give employment to the homeless of the East End. He stood on the stage on the last night and said, "There are horrors enough outside."
For your own sake, Lanyon, do you want to live on as you have? Or do you want to have your safe peace, your reason even, blasted by a sight that would shock the lowest fiend in the inferno?
In the story, Mr. Hyde is not a sexual murderer. Like the Doctor, he doesn't mix with women of any description. He just seems plain evil, and he lives in Soho, in the West End of London. But from now on, all that would change. In every future adaptation, Mr. Hyde would become a sexual murderer. Hyde the Ripper, a killer of prostitutes and a fiend who haunts the fog-bound East End of London.
What I want, I get. You'll come with me.
So the Edinburgh atmosphere of the original disappeared, and the beast in man became a sordid case study in the new science of sexual pathology. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde had been remade to suit the public's darkest expectations of them. In the process, a fear, even hatred of women had been added to the recipe. And Jekyll became Jekyll, the movie pronunciation.
There he is. There's your man.
The story was, by now, quite literally well beyond its author's control.
There's your man.
The experiment was irreversible.
Look! Hey, boy, drop that knife!
Amongst highbrow literary critics, by contrast, the book remained a straightforward morality tale, and Edinburgh's wayward son, who'd left the city behind him, was reclaimed into the role of honour. But the question was, which image of Stevenson would get into the history books? Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde? When members of the Edinburgh establishment decided to erect a monument to the genius of Robert Louis Stevenson about a decade after his death, as a sign that they'd almost forgiven him, here in the august, if slightly gloomy, surroundings of St. Giles Cathedral, they commissioned a huge bronze relief sculpture of an artist saint suffering nobly and stoically, as was the fashion at the time, for his art. It shows RLS sitting in a chaise longue, propped up on a pillow, covered in a tasseled rug, a bundle of papers in his left hand and a quill pen poised in his right, about to produce another masterpiece. This was in fact based on an earlier relief sculpture or medallion made while he lay in bed coughing, having just survived a hero's welcome in New York about 18 months after the publication of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In this, the original version, which he took with him on all his subsequent travels, he'd been sitting up in bed, covered with a blanket, a bundle of papers in his left hand, but in his right, a cigarette, a characteristic pose for receiving guests. For the cathedral version, the bed became a chaise longue, the rug sprouted tassels, Stevenson lost a little bit of weight, and there was that rather improbable quill pen. Artists who made it into the pantheon evidently weren't permitted to smoke in bed. And so the man who was on record as saying that he couldn't write a word without the aid of a cigarette, despite the state of his lungs, and who was so good at rolling his own that an acquaintance said he could make roll-ups as thin as his arms, in other words, thin, had at last become respectable. A paler version of Dr. Henry Jekyll. In fact, of course, he was as much, if not more, like Mr. Edward Hyde. But you wouldn't know that from his monument. The trouble with the cult of Robert Louis Stevenson, fueled by his wife Fanny, most of his friends and relations, and a small clique of adoring critics, is that it's actually affected his reputation. When something as sickly sweet as the authorized version of the life and works of RLS, particularly the life, is incessantly rammed down your throat in the nursery, at school, or from the pulpit, you begin to gag on it. And in many ways, Stevenson's never recovered from this. Jekyll without Hyde is just too one-dimensional, too squeaky clean, too sentimental a construction to be taken entirely seriously. As Lewis himself wrote of one of his characters, about as emotional as a bagpipe. Robert Louis Stevenson spent his last years sailing the South Seas with his mother, his wife, and his stepson, eventually settling in Samoa. This was the image his family and his disciples liked to promote, the boyish adventurer in the land of pirates and pieces of 8. Treasure Island and his poems for children were, they reckoned, his best work and his gift to posterity. At the end of 1894, Robert Louis Stevenson died on the island of Samoa, not of his lung complaint, as everyone expected, but of overwork. He was 44. He was buried in this simple, whitewashed grave. One of his last pieces of writing was a memoir of his childhood in Scotland and of the nightmare of gnomes and bogeymen he'd experienced in his upstairs room at Heriot Row.
The gnome's name is Jekyll and Hyde. I believe you will find he is likewise quite willing to answer to the name Stevenson.
There's a chance to see Spencer Tracy and Ingrid Bergman in the classic 1941 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at 1:05 tonight here on BBC One. Before that, Jamie Lee Curtis stars in the original Halloween next. Christopher Frayling investigates the origins of the great horror myths in this